See all of you here. Please open your New Testaments to Mark chapter 16. And before we get into our lesson, I've got some promises to fulfill, corrections to make, explanations to give. First, I got a text from Mark Gilman, and I'm going to probably do some editing here. He said, "Please thank the church for me. God gave me two things." He says, first, a healthy dose of human. And I think he meant a healthy dose of humility. And a truly beautiful experience on how his family works. There were many beautiful moments with many of our family yesterday. When he was hospitalized, there were a number of people that visited him, and he just wants to express how much that meant to him. The other two things I want to say before we begin are both in our bulletin this morning. One is that you'll see a pair of names under those that are needing prayers, Tony and Steve Nichols. Steve is one of the elders at the church in Issaquah. And his wife this last week was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is not curable. And so they have opted to go into hospice. And so I'm sure that Tony will be going home in the very near future. So please keep both of them. I've known them for 45 years. And they're very dear to me. The other correction is a stupid mistake that I made on the announcements for the upcoming events. I copied the men's breakfast information, pasted it, changed it to Bob Sands' funeral, changed the place to Lewis Funeral, but did not change the time. It's 2 o'clock. It's 2 o'clock on the 22nd. So, having taken care of all of that, those of you who are visiting with us, thank you so much for being here. It's such an encouragement to us to have all of you joining in our worship to God and glorifying Him. And thank you for the edification and encouragement it's brought to us. This is the week of the month, as you can tell from the text that we have in Mark. That this is the month where we study the life of Jesus as it is recorded for us there. And of course, our subject for this morning is the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the signal event in the life of Christ. We just memorialized his death, which was of immense importance. But let me tell you that had he died that death and was still in the grave, it would not mean a thing to us. He had to be raised. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, really underscores that, the importance of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. He discusses it, the whole chapter. But in verse 14 he says, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." And he adds to the surety of that in verse 8, where he says of himself, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So Paul says, I'm a witness. I personally am a witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then he makes this unequivocal statement, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." So we're talking about the resurrection this morning. And our specific verses that we're going to be looking at are verses 1 through 8 of Mark chapter 16. I'm not going to read it now. We're going to be going through those verse by verse in the course of our lesson. I will tell you that our lesson has basically 3 points. We're going to be talking about the empty tomb. We'll talk about the message from the angel. And we'll talk about the message from the women in that verse. But I need to add something else, and especially if you have an NIV that, like mine, as we are going to read through that, and you've probably read that before, it just seems to sort of abruptly end in verse 8. And in fact, there is quite a controversy. There are a number of manuscripts that end in verse 8 of the Greek manuscripts. And then there are others that include verses 9 through 20. I will give you a picture of what my NIV looks like. Verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb because they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then there's this big black line that goes across my text. And underneath that, in a little smaller font, it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. And then in even smaller font and italicized is the rest of the book. So it's a very emphatic statement by the NIV translators that this section of Mark has no business in the New Testament. The ESV looks like this, and then they have the longer ending and a footnote. It starts off with that footnote there in verse 9, and then you go down to the footnotes. It says Mark 16:9 to the Gospel of Mark ends at this point, and some witnesses gives you the witnesses, including most of the respected manuscripts. This is known as the short ending. And then they go on and talk about the intermediate ending. The NASB has that same thing, has a footnote at the beginning, and then it says Mark 16:9. Later manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. Even the New King James Version, which I have in my office, has a footnote about this text in the center column reference. The underlying message of all of this is that this is not a part of God's Word. I think it does. But that's not in our text for this morning. So next month, in a very brief way, I'll try to explain why I think that it ought to be there and why it has every indication that it should be a part of this gospel. So that's kind of a lead into next month and explanation of what's going on in your text there. And while there's a lot more information about the resurrection of Jesus, even included in that latter section there of Mark, in the other Gospels, I'm going to mostly confine myself to Mark. So if you want to keep your Bibles open to Mark 16, that'll be good. Every other time I turn somewhere, the text will be on the screen as we go along. Mark, as we've talked about from the beginning, is trying to be concise, and so I'm already longer than I expected to be at this point in time, but I'm going to try to be concise this morning as well. So let's begin by looking at the first part here, that the tomb is empty. Let's read Mark chapter 16 and verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint the body of Jesus. So the Sabbath is over. The Sabbath is the same as our Saturday, but for the Jews, their Sabbath was over at 6 p.m. on our Saturday. And so as we open the Gospel of Mark here in chapter 16, we're about 12 hours into the first day of the week because it ended at 6 the night before, and we're probably around 6 or 7 in the morning on the day after. You need to appreciate the fact they didn't have names for the days of the week like we have Monday, Tuesday, Friday, all of those. They counted every day from the Sabbath. For instance, in Luke 24 and verse 1, but on the first day of the week, the word for week there is Sabbaton, the first day of the Sabbath, first day after the Sabbath, second day after the Sabbath, etc. And we are told here that the Sabbath was over. And kind of interestingly, as it turns out, it was over forever. Because when Jesus died on the cross and fulfilled the law, his death was the fulfillment of the law. The law of Moses as a binding code from God's point of view also ended. And the text also names for us the women there, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. These are the women that had been with Jesus since Galilee. If you go back to the 15th chapter in verse 40, There were also women looking from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Luke does mention for us one other woman by the name of Joanna in Luke chapter 24 and verse 1. But they are all witnesses of the death of Jesus. They are witnesses of his burial. They were there watching this take place. And now they are, in essence, coming back to finish the job. Listen, they loved and adored Jesus. They are caught up in the horror of what has happened to Jesus because they believed that he was the one. And now he's dead. I really cannot imagine the agony that they are feeling in their hearts. So let's read verse 2. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And so, very early on the first day of the week, they're coming back at the earliest possible time, not with regard to the Sabbath, but just with regard to light, so they can see what they are doing. Matthew tells us that they came at dawn. The Gospel of John will tell us, and we'll read that in a moment, that it was still dark when some of them, at least when Mary Magdalene came. But they all come early. And apparently Mary Magdalene was a little bit earlier. And it says that they came just after sunrise. Listen, between them, where they are in the tomb, and the sun rising in the east is the Mount of Olives. The sun has to come up over that for them to be able to see. So it's going to take some time for the sun to actually shine. But according to the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is the one who arrives first, and it was dark, but obviously not so dark that she can't see. In John chapter 20, starting verse 1, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." And so she comes to a conclusion. I mean, it's light enough to see the stone is gone. She jumps to the conclusion that they've stolen the body, which is wrong, but immediately she goes and tells Peter and the other disciple what her conclusion is. Consequently, she is not with the other women when they arrive. The others seem to still come and arrive together, which brings us now to verse 3. Let's just read the latter part of verse 2. They were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" So again, remember, they saw the burial. They know what was done. They know that this big stone was rolled in front of it. In fact, verse 4 tells us that it was a very large stone. And they are naturally concerned about how they are going to move the stone to get inside to minister to the body of Jesus. Listen, that's just a perfectly natural conversation. How are we going to be able to get inside to do what we've come to do? Verse 4. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. So apparently it's light enough to see for them. We have this very large stone that has been rolled away from the entrance. Then I don't know what they're thinking. Are they relieved? Somebody's already opened the door for us and we can get in. Are they shocked to see that it's already there? And if they're shocked, it may be they're feeling the same thing Mary Magdalene was feeling, and that is that the body has been taken away. But I don't know. They may very well just been relieved that they can get inside. Now, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because I think we need to understand this. And that is that none of these women came to the tomb expecting that Jesus has risen from the dead. Not a single one of them had that thought. They're coming with spices. And they're coming with spices to anoint the dead body of Jesus. None of these women, none of them, including Mary Magdalene, knew what happened yesterday. What happened on the Sabbath day. They don't know anything about the Sanhedrin going and meeting with Pilate. They don't know anything about the sealing of the tomb and the guard being set in front of the tomb, the Roman guard there. And because by the time that they get here on the first day of the week, the guard is already gone. Look at Matthew chapter 28, verse 11. While they, speaking of the women, were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. So the guards are long gone by the time the women come. And we're told here that they entered the tomb. Now, we'll see when we get into verse 5 in a moment, which begins the second point that we're going to make. But I want you to understand that when they get inside, that the point that Mark is trying to make here for us is that the tomb, with respect to Jesus, is empty. And that's his point. Now, let me again kind of set the scene for what we're looking at here and make some comments with regard to that. First of all, the disciples did not steal the body of Christ. Very simple reason why they didn't. And their very simple reason is they didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe that at this particular point that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And listen, you have to believe that there's a resurrection to fake one by stealing his body. The soldiers didn't steal the body. Everybody recognizes that. The women know they hadn't stolen the body because when they get there, it's already gone. The Jewish leaders were the only ones who were worried that the body of Jesus might be stolen. And the reason for that is because the Jewish leaders are a pack of fakes and liars. They're the only ones who would think that somebody might try to steal the body to fake the resurrection, because that's what they would have done. And so that's why they went to Pilate, had them seal the tomb, had it guarded. And the soldiers then, as we just saw or referenced, came back before the women ever got there and told them what happened. They said there was an earthquake, an angel descended and rolled back the stone, and then we passed out, we went into a coma, and then when we woke up, the body was gone. And so here we are telling you what happened. The Sanhedrin knew now that a real resurrection had occurred. They have a real resurrection on their hands, and they have to come up with a plan. And in Matthew chapter 28, verses 12 through 13, when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." They're the ones that had the idea. They concocted that story. They bribed the soldiers to take that story and tell it. And listen, that story persisted for over 25 years, because in chapter 28 and verse 15 says they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. And Matthew was written about 55 or 60 AD. So we're looking at 25 years that story is still persisting. Verse 5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe and sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. So when they got inside, what they saw, according to Mark's description, was a young man sitting on the right side of the tomb, and he's dressed in a white robe. Luke gives us a little bit more of a discussion of that. Luke chapter 24 and verse 4, while they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. And so Luke tells us now there's two of them, and that they are dazzling, like lightning in there. I don't have a problem with any, there's only one that speaks, and that's probably the one that Mark is referring to. I do think it's interesting that there's two, and that Deuteronomy 19, the latter part of verse 15, says a matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, and we've got 2. We have 2 right here. And do not miss the fact that it says the women were alarmed. That's ekthambeo, E-K-T-H-A-M-B-E-O. It means to be amazed, to be awestruck, to be astonished. And let me tell you, you would be too. If you're in the tomb and there's an angel there, you are going to, I can't even imagine what my reaction would be. To say that I was alarmed or astonished, I think is really giving me a lot of credit. So now we come to the second part, and that is the message of the angels, and let's look at verse 6. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. And so the angel speaks. The first thing he says is, don't be alarmed. And my reaction to that's easy for you to say. But he's trying to reassure them. And he tells them, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified, which tells them that they are in the right place. Because that's exactly what they are looking for there. And what is about to be said concerns Jesus, and that is he is risen. He's not here, and you can see for yourself. And so here is the first message of the resurrection. He is the risen one in the Greek. We have egeiro, E-G-E-I-R-O is the Greek word, and it's passive, and so basically could be translated, he has been raised. It was something that was done to Jesus. He was raised. And then he invites them to see the place where they laid him, and the they there would be Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. According to the Gospel of John, what they would see there is just the clothing, the burial wraps. But he is not there. But the bottom line is, because these are angels speaking, this is a message from God. The message from God given by these angels here, and God's testimony is, he's risen. He's not here. Verse 7. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So the angel continues to give them this message, and the message is go. Go tell his disciples. Go tell his disciples and Peter. And again, as an angel, as we learn from the other Gospels, not from Mark here, this is a command of God. This is God's words being given by them. Go tell the disciples. And specifically, he names Peter here. And you might say, well, why Peter? Well, Peter's situation is a little bit more tentative considering what he's done in the last 48 hours, which includes denying that he even knew Jesus 3 times. So he's getting a specific or special message from God. And the message here is that Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee. And in fact, the angel here says, just as he told you. And if you go back to Mark the 14th chapter in verse 28, Jesus told them ahead of time, but after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. So Jesus had told them that. And let me tell you here, they did not immediately go to Galilee. Partly because they didn't believe anybody that came and told them that Jesus was raised. And so they didn't believe the women. And listen, if we just had Matthew's account, we would think they did. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountains where Jesus had told them to go. Matthew just goes right along and says, there they go. And they did go later. And we'll cover this text in Mark next week. But speaking of the women, they returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Luke has a reference to Jesus appearing to Peter. Luke has a reference to Jesus appearing to two on the road to Emmaus. And then appearing to the apostles there. Actually appearing to the women themselves as they were coming back. They appeared on the road to Emmaus, and then these women, as we'll see in just a minute. And when he finally is with the 11 and trying to convince them, he says, "You got any food?" And so he ate in front of them to convince them that it was him. The Gospel of John records two meetings. One in Jerusalem with the 10 of the 12. And then 8 days later, appearing to them again in Jerusalem with Thomas there. So it's been over a week since Jesus' resurrection. They're still in Jerusalem. They haven't gone into Galilee yet, but they will go. They finally go. And I think I mentioned a short time ago in a lesson that I think that where Paul mentions that he appeared to 500 brethren at once is going to occur in Galilee when he's up there. So let's read the final verse here, verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, still speaking of the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And so they're still in amazement. They're still in fear. They're trembling. They're bewildered. And they didn't walk out of the tomb. They fled from the tomb, which again is exactly what we might do. I can remember, well, when I finally had the nerve as a child to go to a haunted house on Halloween. When I got out of there, man, I was flying out of that place. And I can picture that that's what they did. We're also told here that they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And I'm assuming here, but I assume that they said nothing to anyone that they might have met on their way to tell Peter and the disciples what they have seen. And so them not telling anybody was temporary because, again, they were on their way to do the very thing that the angel told them to do, which is to tell the disciples. I do not want us to lose sight of the fact that the testimony of the resurrection, the first heralds of the good news of Jesus Christ, was given by women. Given to women to share. First by the angels, then by Jesus himself. So they're chosen to be the first heralds. And Jesus appeared, remember, here's Mary Magdalene. She's gone to the tomb very early. She sees the stone. She's assumed that they've stolen the body. She's gone back to tell the disciples. They don't believe it. And then she goes back to the tomb. And in John chapter 20, verse 16 through 18, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned around toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord, and she told them that he had said these things to her. This is her second visit to them, this time with the truth. Jesus is also going to appear to the other women that the angels sent. In Luke 24, verses 9 through 11, when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed like nonsense. So Mary Magdalene has joined the women again on the second trip. And in fact, you'll see that something else happened in between. So the women hurried away from the tomb, just as our text in Mark says, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him and clasped his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said, do not be afraid. Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. So when Mary Magdalene and the women show up, the women for the first time, Mary Magdalene for the second time, we have eyewitnesses now of Jesus' resurrection. And they return afraid yet filled with joy, because as they go along, they realize this is true. And it became clear. And then Jesus confirmed that. And now they know their Lord is alive. So, as we said at the beginning, there are some who believe that Mark's gospel ends in verse 8. And if it did, then the message of Mark is he's risen and you'll see him. That's the conclusion that we could come from that. I think it very much fulfills the whole point of Mark, the beginning of the good news, the gospel about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And we know from Romans that the resurrection is the thing that gives us the evidence that he's the Son of God. And I'll just add here again, I don't believe that it ends at verse 8, and we'll spend some time at the beginning of our lesson next month, Lord willing, to discuss that. I want us to note the basic content of the gospel message as presented by Peter in the first sermon that he gave on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. And the points of that lesson are that Jesus was a man approved by God on the basis of his signs and miracles. And they all knew about that there in Jerusalem. At least the locals for sure did. His second point was, you killed him. His third point is, but God raised him from the dead. And in the process of giving that information, he's going to point to the prophetic record. He's going to state that we are eyewitnesses of that. He's also going to say it's the testimony of the Holy Spirit. As you can see, we're sitting here with tongues of fire on our heads, and we're all talking in languages that we don't know, but we're speaking them in your native tongue. And then, of course, and I don't think I have this on there, his final point is that he's sitting at the right hand of God. God has made him Lord and Christ. All of that is still true today. Still true. The offer of salvation through Jesus Christ is still available. It has not yet, that offer has not yet expired. But it will expire. When Jesus comes back again, it will no longer be available. But the offer of God's salvation by his grace through your faith is still available to you today. And if you want that, if you long for salvation, you want to be a part of the family of God, that can happen for you today. And we're going to sing the song that Mike has selected, number 762. Go ahead and click that up there, Kevin, so I can see what it says.
Where he leads me.
What is it?
Where he leads me, I will follow.
Where he leads me, I will follow. I hope that you can sing that. I hope that you can sing that and it be true for you. And if it's not, and you want it to be true, then please come forward while we stand and sing.